Tank blasting. Narrator: the M1 Abrams tank is one of the most powerful ground weapons in the U.S. arsenal. Equipped with a 1,500 horsepower turbine engine and a top speed of more than 40 miles per hour. It comes with a 120mm cannon, 3 machine guns, and armor that can withstand frontal hits from enemy tanks with minimal damage. And these tanks could help Ukrainian forces take back Russian-occupied territories. Tank blasting. But Pentagon officials have expressed concerns that these tanks could pose major logistical issues for Ukraine. The Abrams requires a lot of support, and if the Ukrainians don't have everything that it takes to operate the Abrams, they might end up being more of a detriment than they are a help. Narrator: if Ukrainians want to take full advantage of the M1 Abrams tanks, they'll have to solve several major logistical challenges, complicated tech and repairs. So this binder right here. This contains all the information and coordinating details to operate a battalion of Abrams tanks for 4 days in the field. Narrator: Dan Grazier is a Marine Corps veteran who operated Abrams tanks for almost a decade. Old Western tanks are a lot more complex than the old Soviet tanks. There's a lot of upgraded electronics. They're much more intricately designed. Narrator: Ukraine already has a lot of skilled tank operators who have experience working on older Soviet-era tanks, like T-72s. You've got to remember, they've been fighting the Russians since 2014. So they are not gonna be starting from scratch, learning how to drive a tank here. They will have to learn how to use the Abrams tanks. They'll have to learn how to use the targeting system. The Abrams is a 4-person tank. The Soviet tanks have 3 people in them. So they'll have to learn details. But if you know how to drive a tank, you know how to drive a tank. So one way to think about this would be you go from a 10-year-old Toyota to a new Tesla. You know how to drive. You just have to learn how to do it on this new vehicle. Narrator: these new Abrams tanks boast impressive technology. The tech enables troops to fire at night from longer ranges than Russian tanks, navigate through waters up to 4 feet deep, and shoot rounds with a range of 2.5 miles. But the more complicated the technology, the more likely it is to break. And depending on what needs to be repaired, the parts may need to be sent all the way back to manufacturing plants in the US. Then after they're repaired, they'll need to be sent back to Ukraine. A lot of the individual components inside the tank were designed not necessarily to be repaired in the field, but to be replaced in the field. It could be days or possibly even weeks for them to get a replacement component. Narrator: and if a tank has to wait on a replacement part? If the tank doesn't get everything that it needs, in terms of spare parts, of fuel, of even lubricants and hydraulic fluid, you only have to lose 1 or 2 of those things to render a tank ineffective, and it becomes little more than a giant 72-ton paperweight on the battlefield. Logistics issues for refueling. Narrator: and one of the most logistically difficult parts for maintaining an M1 Abrams tank is fueling it. The reluctance within the Pentagon to sending the Abrams tanks had a lot to do with how difficult it is to keep them in the fight. Abrams tanks use a lot of gas because they're very large, heavy vehicles, so it takes a great deal of energy to be able to even get that thing to start moving. Narrator: in order to avoid the risk of running out of fuel, Abrams tanks typically travel with fuel trucks. The tanks can store about 500 gallons of fuel and can go about 275 miles on a single fill-up. And while it takes a lot of gas to start and run an Abrams tank, it also consumes a huge amount of fuel even when it's idle. Just the capacity is gonna be the big challenge. Just making sure that they have enough fuel to power these tanks, that might be a challenge for them. Tanks are only one part of the overall equation. The tanks require a lot of support. So they require refueler vehicles. They require maintenance vehicles. They require ammunition trucks, to support them. And if you take those out, if you're really able to disrupt that supply chain, then the tanks are irrelevant at that point. Narrator: tanks are able to get through a variety of terrains, but tank support vehicles can have a difficult time traveling through mud, snow, and other rough terrains. If conditions degrade, bridges are out, excessive mud, deep snow, that can all disrupt the supply chain and make it a lot harder to properly refuel and rearm those tanks. Narrator: and for the tanks to operate the most effectively, Ukrainian forces will need to manage a pipeline of high-quality fuels. The turbine engine in the Abrams is a multi-fuel engine. The efficiency and the effectiveness of the, of the engine would be reduced if you're using kind of a lower grade fuel. The kind of diesel fuel that the military uses will work quite well in the Abrams. And as long as the Ukrainians have access to quality diesel fuel, they should be able to operate the Abrams just fine. Ukrainian supply chains. Narrator: but the US's Abrams tanks aren't the only tanks that Ukraine needs to plan for. It will need to manage supply chains to support multiple types of tanks, including its existing Soviet-era T-72s, Britain's Challenger 2s, Germany's Leopards, and the US's M1 Abrams tanks. And while other tanks may not require as much fuel as the Abrams, Grazier says Britain's Challenger 2 and Germany's Leopard are also technically more complex than Ukraine's current tanks. There are gonna be some differences in the details as far as how they're supported. And I think that's gonna be a big challenge for the Ukrainians in having to maintain 3 separate supply chains to be able to support these 3 different tanks that they're going to be receiving there over the next couple of months. Why the US sent tanks. Narrator: so if Ukrainian forces will need to navigate complicated technology, gas-guzzling engines, and create multiple complex supply chains, why did the US decide to send the Abrams tank? Ukraine needs foreign tanks because the ones they have keep getting blown up by the Russians. They need more tanks, and the Abrams tank is a good one. There aren't that many old Soviet tanks around for Ukraine to go shopping for. It was designed for the Cold War to fight the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. So for the Abrams to go to Ukraine now is, in a way, almost like it's going home. Right now, what Ukraine needs is offensive capabilities. Not so much defensive to protect their territory, but offensive to enable them to drive the Russians out of their turf. If you want to take back ground in a ground war, you need that kind of heavy armor to do it. Tank engine rumbling. English. Galaxy Z Fold 5. Ad. Samsung.com/park. Buy now.